If one goes back and looks in some of the late medieval or early Renaissance, depending on your periodization, chronicles, one will find the name Machiavelli. That is to say, it's an old Florentine family. You find them in tax records and political lists and all the rest of it. But it's fair to say that Niccolo Machiavelli did not come from the more distinguished or prosperous branch of the Machiavelli family. Just like there were some not very wealthy Medici running around Florence even in the 15th century, Machiavelli was from a lesser branch of a well-known Florentine family. He was born in the year 1469. Again, this is an important year in Florentine history because it marks the year when Piero de' Medici dies and Lorenzo, called Lorenzo the Magnificent, becomes the de facto ruler of Florence. And for the first 23 years of Machiavelli's life, that is what most people look back on today as the heyday of Florence. It is the time when great things politically are happening. Florence is relatively at peace during this period. Cosimo de' Medici, the grandfather of Lorenzo, had negotiated or been a major negotiator in a kind of Italy-wide deal in 1454 called the Peace of Lodi, sometimes called Lodi, but Lodi would be the Italian pronunciation, where the 5 major states on the Italian peninsula sort of agreed to a framework where they can live with each other in relative peace. Those 5, by the way, are Venice, Milan, Florence, the Papal States, and the King of Sicily, who is located in Naples. Okay, the island of Sicily is a different political entity and sort of out of it, if you will, with regard to the politics we're going to talk about. And so Machiavelli not only grew up in a place that was culturally flourishing. Michelangelo was 6 years his junior. Fra Angelico was painting away. Botticelli was roughly a contemporary, a little bit older contemporary of Machiavelli. But he also grew up in a time of both Florentine stability and, relatively speaking, Italian stability. And it's important to remember in his own life, he saw a great change from a kind of order to a kind of chaos. And clearly that got inside his soul, and he became fanatically interested in his political career and in his writing that occurred mostly after his political career ended, to find some ways so that Italy could prosper and be relatively orderly and peaceful. We know very little about the childhood of Machiavelli. One of the details we know, I've mentioned it before, but it's an important detail, and that is his dad did the index to an edition in Latin of Livy, the great Roman historian. And part of the payment for the index was a copy of the book. It was an early printed book. We need to remember early printed books were still expensive, not as expensive as manuscripts, but it wasn't really until the early 16th century that printing radically lowered the price of published material. And so a family wouldn't have owned very many books, but we know that one of the books in the Casa Machiavelli was Livy's early history of Rome. And of course, that's an essentially important detail because, again, as I'm going to argue, the most important work intellectually of Niccolo Machiavelli was a commentary or discourses on the first 10 books of Livy. We know that Machiavelli received a good education in Latin and that he has a great familiarity in his writing with the Latin classics. He did not learn Greek, but again, he wouldn't have had to read Thucydides or Plato. He wasn't one of the intellectual elites who had read Greek, but he had a good knowledge of Latin and therefore could read what he wanted to read, both from Roman and Greek antiquity. He did also read what we might call modern writers. He liked Petrarch, and in fact he quotes Petrarch, but his real love was Dante Alighieri. He talks about in his letters reading Dante. He quotes from Dante's Divine Comedy. He was the lover of that great Florentine poet who was, among other things, we need to remember, a very political poet. Although Florence was relatively peaceful, and the Medici had a pretty firm grip on matters while Machiavelli was growing up, we don't want to forget, as I've mentioned before and will mention several times more, the great event of 1478, the so-called Pazzi conspiracy, an attempt to kill Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano. His brother Giuliano was murdered in the Cathedral of Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici fled in safety to the sacristy, and his survival led to a very quick retaliation by Florentines against those who had participated in the Pazzi conspiracy, including the Archbishop of Pisa, who was hanged outside on the tower of the city hall. Now, Machiavelli's 9. I think sometimes when we're doing history, we can be too highfalutin. I try to think back about when I was 9. I was 9 in the first year of the Eisenhower administration. And I can remember several things that did, in fact, impact me, none of which is probably as dramatic and immediate as the Pazzi conspiracy. I can remember the end of the Korean War, because I was afraid my dad was going to go fight after he'd fought in World War II. And I remember that Vice President Nixon came to my hometown to dedicate a hospital. The first time somebody in my lifetime of that level of power had been in my hometown. I didn't see him in person. I watched him on a local TV cutaway in 1953. So we all know, if we think about our own experiences, how, first of all, we remember things from when we were 9, but secondly, we remember them in part because people talked about them around the dinner table or driving me to Little League practice for years afterwards. The Korean War didn't go away in conversation around the dinner table when I was 9 or 10 years old. It continued for a long time. So we need to appreciate the fact that Machiavelli witnessed this attempt to eliminate the Medici, and he witnessed the response of the Florentines to it. Whether this is what got him interested in politics, we might say today, we don't know. But certainly he writes a lot about the Pazzi conspiracy in various works of his. In 1494, Machiavelli is now 25 years old. The French invade Italy. The Florentine leader, Lorenzo's son Piero, handles it badly and is forced into exile, and Florence once again returns to a more clear and direct republican form of government. Remember that the Florentines always used the word republic to describe Florence, but really the Medici dominated Florentine politics for 60 years. Now there's sort of a fresh start constitutionally, with new figures that come to the fore in the absence of the Medici, and with the presence in Italy of the French, and not too long thereafter, Germans, Swiss, and Spanish as well. We certainly must expect that Machiavelli would have heard the sermons of the great preacher Savonarola. He preached not only in his own church, San Marco, but he also preached in the cathedral, and he was a dominant figure in leading Florence toward a certain kind of republican government. And when Machiavelli writes about Savonarola, he writes about him respectfully, although certainly he was never caught up in Savonarola's ultimately apocalyptic fervor, or his burning of the wigs and the paintings and all the other vanities that he called for in various bonfires. No doubt Machiavelli was in Florence when Savonarola's life came to an end. When ultimately Savonarola would not obey papal orders, he was tried, convicted, and executed in the main square of Florence in May of 1498. So all of these stories that we sort of hear in our textbooks, we see in films about the Renaissance, they're part of the lived experience of Machiavelli. By the time he's 25 years old, he can remember the best days of Lorenzo de' Medici. He can remember the unveiling of great works of art. He can remember the Pazzi conspiracy. He could remember what would have been seen even then as the tragedy of the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, the incompetence of Piero, the invasion of the French, the preaching of Savonarola, the burning of Savonarola. These are all things that are already in the experience of the young man Niccolo Machiavelli, who's not yet 30 years old. Just a few days after Savonarola was burned, Machiavelli received his first job with the government. He was appointed as Secretary of the Second Chancery. That was his official title. And when we see pictures of him, he's usually dressed in the outfit he would have worn as an official of the Florentine Republic. What did the Second Chancery do? Remembering that secretary is an important job, like today we use the term Secretary of State or whatever, he is an important official in the Second Chancery. It did two things. First of all, it dealt with the territory that belonged to Florence. It was part of the Florentine state outside the walls. A lot of towns, a lot of countryside to administer. Secondly, it dealt at least somewhat with foreign affairs, remembering that foreign affairs don't mean just outside of Italy. They mean first and foremost Siena, Lucca, and other neighboring independent city-states in Italy. And so Machiavelli got his job in 1498. He held that job and later on got a second job for 14 years until the collapse of the Republic in 1512. He kept the Florentine government, which was changing leaders all the time in many of the bodies that deliberated, although there was a head of government named Piero Soderini who was around the whole time. He informed the government about military matters, and he seemed to have made enough of an impression that he began doing diplomatic missions. One that clearly affected him for the rest of his life was the fact that he was in the presence, on more than one occasion, of Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI. Popes had sons back in those days and admitted it, we need to remember. Alexander VI, member of the Borgia family, had, you may recall, a son and a daughter, Lucretia. And much of the pontificate of Alexander VI dealt with finding Cesare some land and Lucretia a husband. Neither one came easily for Alexander VI, as it turned out. And he was with Cesare Borgia, in fact, when Alexander VI died. That happened at a time when Cesare was ill. And therefore, despite the fact that he admired Cesare Borgia, he saw the way Cesare Borgia took a piece of land, got control of it, brought order to it. He'll talk about that a lot in The Prince, and we'll look at those passages in great detail. But he also saw the end of Cesare Borgia's career, when, if you will, the wrong guy was elected pope to succeed Alexander VI, the member of the Borgia family who was Cesare's father, and Cesare's little empire in Italy collapsed. So he witnesses the best and the worst of Cesare Borgia. This gives him a real sense of Italian politics and what's going on in Italy and how things work and how diplomacy works and what kinds of activities work, because Cesare is that important kind of prince. He did not inherit any land. He took what he ruled. And the question is, if you do that, if you acquire a principality, how do you run it? How do you get it organized? How do you get respect? How do you maintain power? And of course, those are going to be principal issues in The Prince, because The Prince, not entirely, but largely, is about those princes who acquire new territories. Cesare is the single most important model that he has. Beginning in 1500, he's only been in the job a couple of years now, this Machiavelli guy has. Beginning in 1500, Machiavelli began to participate in diplomatic missions to France and to the Holy Roman Empire. And in fact, that meant he traveled outside of Italy. He was in the presence of both the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, and he got what today we would think of as greater international exposure. Although technically, again, Italy's a bunch of countries. Getting outside of Italy clearly gave him a much broader perspective. And he will not just be able to compare one Italian city-state with another, or the ancient Roman Republic with one Italian city-state, but he will also be able to talk about German free cities. He'll be able to talk about the King of France. And therefore, his bag of modern examples and illustrations is much more filled than it would have been had he simply remained a figure that was involved doing things in Italy. During the years when Machiavelli was working for the Florentine government, like all or virtually all young men who did not go into the clergy, Machiavelli married. How do we say this nicely? Machiavelli wasn't real big on keeping his wedding vows. There was, it seems, an almost endless and open group of mistresses and prostitutes, which he tells about sometimes in quite vulgar detail, sort of more than you want to know about what happens in the basement of some dive someplace or other where Machiavelli has gone. Machiavelli began to write during his years as an employee, as an official of the Florentine government. Some of those things are simply government reports, but also he began to write other works as well. And also in these years, Machiavelli began to write letters. I emphasized this in the first lecture, and I'm going to read from one of his letters later on in this lecture. The letters provide us a much richer sense of who this man is, how he's living his life, how his thought is developing. And so this great treasure trove of letters really begins not from the period when he's writing the famous works, The Prince and the Discourses and whatever, but when he is a Florentine Republican official. Now, Machiavelli looked around and he said, what are the problems we in the Florentine Republic have to solve? There are obviously all the diplomatic problems dealing with other countries. But one that Machiavelli saw that became, it's probably fair to say, an obsession is that Florence needed a citizen army. Florence, like other city-states, even in the 13th century, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, more and more relied on mercenaries. Not individuals, but paid companies, bought companies of soldiers, usually under the leadership of some minor noble in Italy who's out to make a fortune and perhaps even capture a territory to rule. Machiavelli knew enough Florentine history to know that in the good old days, a long time ago, when Florence was more successful than it was in his own day militarily, Florence had a citizen army. And so he began, as an official of the Republic, to recruit a citizen army. Well, let me just say that that citizen army had a mixed record in the last years of the Florentine Republic. It had some modest successes. It had some very serious defects. But this was important enough to enough people that Machiavelli was actually given a second job where he was sort of put in charge of organizing a militia among Florentines within the Florentine Republic. So he becomes not just a diplomatic guy, but also a military guy. And then in 1512, it all fell apart. After a defeat of the Florentines resulted in a slaughter of 4,000 people in the nearby city of Prato, which was part of the Florentine Republic, the Republic collapsed and the Medici returned in 1512. With the return of the Medici, Machiavelli was fired. He was so identified with the Republican regime that he was simply dismissed from office. In fact, Machiavelli was briefly arrested and even tortured. That didn't last very long, and he could have continued to live in Florence, but he chose not to. Perhaps you'd be a little bit squeamish if you think, gosh, they might change their mind and get into this torture stuff again. But at any rate, Machiavelli chose to live on the family farm south of Florence. He commuted into Florence a lot. This family farm is in, and I mean a tiny village called Sant'Andrea in Percusina, in a house called the Albergaccio. And that's where Machiavelli lived really on and off the rest of his life. Now, I went there this summer. It is really in the boonies. It's about 12 kilometers from Florence, but you'd swear to God there were only olive trees and vineyards. In fact, today they sell olive oil and wine made from plants on the Machiavelli estate. But what's interesting is from the backyard of a very modest villa, one can actually see the dome of the Cathedral of Florence, probably clearer then than now because of pollution. And I remember standing there and just sort of wondering, boy, just every day of his life, Machiavelli, you sort of picture him standing there and saying, damn, I wish I were there. I wish I were in all the hustle and bustle. I wish I were going off to my job in the government and really wheeling and dealing and making things better. And here I am on this farm. And I just sort of need to stay here. And this is the place that I operate out of. So this kind of voluntary retirement took place in Sant'Andrea in Percusina. Now, what did he do there? Well, Machiavelli's not a rich guy. And so he had to manage the estate while he was there. And some of the letters that he writes during this early period, especially at Sant'Andrea, are really quite funny. He's got to go, sell some birds. And he's got to make sure that, Giacomo the farmer or whoever it is taking care of things he's supposed to be taking care of. And, well, there's an inn right across the street. And you go there and you have a glass of wine and you play cards and other games and you talk about trivia with all these sort of brutish guys who work out in the country. I'm not using my language now. I'm sort of paraphrasing Machiavelli. And he finds himself occupied in the day with things that he regards as trivia. Because this guy really is a political animal. He wants to be where the action is, and the action is not selling thrushes. So somebody can have thrush dinner. That's not what Machiavelli wants to do. But, again, it's safer there. And in one of his most famous letters, he writes to his friend Francesco Vettori in Rome. He says, there was another side. Let me read you this passage, probably the most famous passage from all of Machiavelli's letters. When evening comes, I return to my home, and I go into my study, and on the threshold I take off my everyday clothes, which are covered with mud and mire, and I put on regal and curial robes, and dressed in a more appropriate manner I enter into the ancient courts of ancient men, and am welcomed by them kindly. And there I taste the food that alone is mine, and for which I was born. And there I am not ashamed to speak to them. I ask them the reasons for their actions, and they in their humanity answer me. And for 4 hours I feel no boredom. I dismiss every affliction. I no longer fear poverty, nor do I tremble at the thought of death. Machiavelli says, I go in my library, I change clothes, and I get out these ancient books. I read Livy. I read Cicero. I read these other works. And notice, remember I said that in the mid-14th century, that Petrarch writes a letter to Cicero? Notice what Machiavelli says. I converse with these great authors. I ask them questions, and they answer me. This is part of the great genius of Niccolo Machiavelli. I think we all understand something of what he's getting at, because when you read old books seriously, and you're not merely an antiquarian, you're asking those authors questions. Sometimes questions they couldn't have directly imagined, because you ask them a question that comes out of your experience, individually or politically. We all know we'd like to ask the great thinkers of the past, well, what would you do today if you were around and problem X was in front of you? And an intelligent reading of those classics tries to say, I'm going to try to find the answer. I'm not going to make it up. I'm not going to say this is what I want Cicero to say, and therefore this is what Cicero says. You have to read these books carefully. You've got to not have them simply say what you'd like them to say, but really to answer based on your careful reading of what their principles were, what their method of argumentation was, what their kind of evidence was, and how they used evidence to draw conclusions about their own day or about their own past. And when I walked into that room, it's not a museum, I was able to get in there. When you walk into that room, there's still a desk where Machiavelli's desk would be. And it isn't a very big room. But one pictures him taking off that robe, or putting on that robe, taking off the farmer's clothes. And one pictures him with a big book, because books tend to be bigger in those days. Not very many books. There wouldn't have been shelves lined with books like we think of as a library today. But taking down a copy of Livy, or a copy of Cicero, or a copy of Thucydides, and sitting there and talking to those folks. Not literally, but really asking them questions, not as an antiquarian. Now, exactly where did that soldier move in 434 BC when he did this and whatever? Not that. But rather asking him broader questions. Finding ways to apply ancient understanding, ancient wisdom, ancient experience, including ancient experience gone wrong, to his own life and to the situation of his own life. And so it was there in that room, in fact, that he wrote The Prince and that he wrote the discourses on Livy over the next several years. That's the context, that removal from the everyday and that withdrawal into a more pure kind of thought than he could have had were he a government official where he's also got to write a report for tomorrow or deal with some damn diplomat from Siena tomorrow. Not to do that. He really is able to be with those great authors. Well, he also began to go into Florence and become associated with a humanist circle, some people who would get together in the garden of a villa of the Rucellai family, and they would read classical texts together, not just historical or philosophical texts, but all kinds of literature. And that's probably the origin of him writing 3 plays. The Mandrake Route, La Mandragola, is the most famous of the plays that Machiavelli wrote. We don't often think of him as a playwright. They're pretty funny. On occasion, they're pretty dirty. But Machiavelli grew into that sort of larger sense of the humanities, not only the political text, but still, bottom line, he was a political animal. He wrote a biography of Castruccio Castracani, a 14th century military leader from Lucca, and many think that it was a kind of application to the Medici. If that's true, it was successful because Cardinal Giulio de' Medici commissioned Machiavelli to write a history of Florence. By the way, Giulio de' Medici, shortly after that time, was elected as Pope Clement VII, and therefore, by the time it was finished, it was the work that had been commissioned by the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. While writing it, this history of Florence, he also, Machiavelli did, write a book called The Art of War, the only political work published in his own lifetime. Machiavelli wanted to get back into office. He wanted to be a player in Florentine politics again. In addition to writing a history for the Medici, he was indeed, in 1526, given a fairly minor job concerning the defense and the defensive structures for the city of Florence. But in 1527, the Holy Roman Emperor sacked Rome, weakening the Pope, who was a Medici, remember. And the weakening of the Medici in Rome led to the expulsion of the Medici from Florence early in 1527. This is one of those good news, bad news situations for Machiavelli. It's good news because there can be a republic again. It's bad news because, well, in recent years, the Medici had actually commissioned him to do some things. Machiavelli hoped to get his old job back and didn't. Probably, as I mentioned earlier, because in the eyes of the people putting together the new government, he was too associated with the Medici. What an irony. He died in June of 1527 and was immediately buried in the Franciscan church of Santa Croce, a church that also contains the bodies of Michelangelo and Galileo. So Machiavelli dies just as a republic was forming again. So that's now the background. We have some history of Florence. We have some history of humanist thought. We have a biography of Machiavelli. Roll up your sleeves because we're ready to go to the Prince and start our process of reading that extraordinarily important work.